Donald Trump goes around saying he loves America. Donald Trump doesn't love America. If he loved America, he would have peacefully walked away when the voters rejected him. He's trying to become our dictator, and we need to be clear about that. And all of the politicians who are trying to make sure they don't get primaried by speaking up on Donald's behalf right now, they are facilitating a man who wants to end our constitutional government because Donald believes, that no one but he is competent to be president of the United States, which is unbelievably laughable. Donald Trump is all about money. And you, every one of you sitting in this room, you either recognized his greatness and bask in it and glory in it, or Donald has a word for you. Loser. Donald is a man who's publicly humiliated the mother of his children, who you'll read in my book made up stories that beautiful women, Kim Basinger, Madonna, Carla Bruni, were pounding on his bedroom door because, after all, every woman in America has got to have Donald. By the way, not only did none of these women want to notch their lipstick case, two of them had never met him, apparently, and the third one had a brief conversation with him and refers to him as the king of sleaze. Now, Donald has spent his entire life doing business with con artists, with mafia, with Russian mobsters, with swindlers, his entire life. Not surprisingly, since his father, Fred Trump, a very industrious guy who also was a profiteer on post-World War II housing projects, had a business partner, Willie Tomasello, who, according to law enforcement reports and the New York State Organized Crime Task Force, was an associate and a front for the Gambino and Genovese organized crime families. So Donald, not unsurprisingly, after graduating from college, where, he keeps saying nobody's ever seen President Obama when he went to Colombia. Like, the women who've been interviewed about the dates they went on with him and the people who played basketball with him. None of those people apparently exist to Donald. Hardly anybody saw him at Penn, although I did interview Candace Bergen, who told me that they did go on a date, which, as she put it, ended early. But when Donald got to New York, he made a beeline to the notorious Roy Cohn, Senator Joe McCarthy's attack dog. And that relationship helped him. He regarded Roy Cohn as a second father and as a mentor, and he said in writing that he loved Roy Cohn because Roy would brutalize for you. Roy would brutalize for you. So that leads me to this story I want to tell you about what happened when Donald's father, Fred, died. Fred was a really industrious guy. I mean, he had a little business at the age of 15. So did I. And when he died, 2 days or 3 days after his funeral, a new great-grandchild was born. A descendant in the line of Freddie Trump Jr., who had died early. He was an alcoholic and did not have a happy life. And this child immediately became ill, desperately ill, stopped breathing twice, needed terrifically expensive medical care. Now, like many family-owned businesses, the Trumps provide everyone in the family with health care. And Donald is a big believer, it's one of the best things about Donald, in universal health care. Well, Robert Trump wrote a letter to the company's insurance administrator, Precise, and said, whatever the bills are, just pay them. Don't ask questions, just pay the bills to take care of this child. And then Fred Trump's will was read. And it turned out that instead of dividing his pie 5 ways, it was divided 4. The line of the late Freddie Trump Jr. was cut out of the will, except for some minor gifts. Surprise, surprise, that line of the family went to court arguing undue influence.
In this video, guys, we have a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, that is David K. Johnston, who takes a deep look at Donald Trump's business's career, his relationships, his public image, and the way he has operated throughout his life. Johnston isn't simply talking about Trump's political career. he is asking much bigger question. Who was Donald Trump before he became president? And what can that history tell us about the way he leads? And as you listen to the presentation, you begin to understand why Johnston believes Trump's story is much more complicated than the image presented to the public. So guys, let's take a close look at this video. And remember, you're going to buy me a coffee if you're going to click the subscription button, guys. So let's get into the video.
Though Fred Trump had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's about 1.5 or 2 years after he wrote his last will, they argued that some influence had been applied on him to cut them out of the will. The reaction to this by Donald Trump was that he immediately cut off all health care for this child. I want you to think about this. Donald Trump, over money, put the life of a sickly infant in jeopardy, his own blood, over money. And when he was asked about this, he said, well, what else can I do? Well, don't you think this would look cold-hearted? And Donald's answer is essentially, well, you know, I don't like people who sue my father's estate. No compassion for the child any more than there was no compassion for the Khan family whose son is a serving American military officer killed in combat. No empathy for another person, because other people to Donald are simply objects to be used. Now, I want to contrast what happened with this sickly child. A judge ordered that the health care continue. There was some kind of negotiated settlement. And as Donald does with negotiated settlements all the time, and by the way, contrary to his statement, he never settles, he settles all the time. The condition of settling was they had to seal the record. So we don't know exactly what was done for this child. Well, Donald was confronted with the issue of mercy a few years earlier. So as I tell you this, keep in mind that Donald had no mercy for his own grandnephew. Donald had a famous helicopter. In the 80s, you may have seen him flying around in it and getting pictures of it, called the Ivana. It's a Euro supercopter. And then he had a fleet of helicopters to run high rollers down to Atlantic City and back. And these copters were provided and managed by a guy named Joe Wexelbomb, a convicted felon and associate of mob families. There were lots of companies that had helicopters. There were better financed companies than this one, but this is who Donald chose. It turns out Joe Wexelbomb had a second business. He was a major drug trafficker. He ran a drug ring that got cocaine and marijuana from Colombia. They picked it up in Miami. According to the court papers, Joe Wexelbomb personally handled the drugs. He sometimes helped load them into the cars. He would give the drivers money or plane tickets or whatever they needed to go on. And they would go up to Cincinnati and areas near there. He was indicted in the fall of 1985. Now, when you own a casino, you have a privilege. The Supreme Court, and those of you who read my book, Temples of Chance, know that casinos are not a right, they are a privilege. Therefore, the state can impose virtually any rule it wants on you. And the state of New Jersey said you must prove by clear and convincing evidence that you can pay your bills on time, that you are morally fit, and that you do not associate with criminals. Well, Donald didn't get rid of Joe Wexelbomb's helicopter company at this point. Joe Wexelbomb then agreed to plead guilty. The DEA had him cold. And he asked that his case be moved either to Miami, where the drugs began and he had a home, or New York City, where he lived. The case instead was moved to New Jersey, which neither the prosecutors nor the defense lawyer have ever been able to explain. And it came before, out of the more than 800 district court judges in America, Judge Marianne Trump Berry, his sister. Now, Judge Berry is required to recuse herself from this case, and she did about 3 weeks later. But just think about the conversation that went on here. She goes to the chief judge and says, I can't handle this case with this big drug trafficker because my husband, who's a lawyer for my brother's casinos, he flies in those helicopters all the time, and I fly in those helicopters, and you're the chief judge saying, I got a federal judge flying around in a drug trafficker's helicopters. Potential here for real embarrassing things to happen for the federal judiciary. Donald, meanwhile, shows his mercy to this man. He writes a letter pleading for him to get a short sentence, calling him diligent, saying basically he's a stand-up guy, who should be treated lightly by the courts. When the New Jersey Division of Gaming Enforcement goes to ask Donald about the letter, he says, I don't know what you're talking about. You could construe that as a cover-up, certainly as lying. So they go back and get the letter that they didn't have. They show him the letter, and Donald says, yeah, that's my signature. End of inquiry. Not, why are you doing business with this guy? Why did you do business with this guy? What other business relationship did you have with him? What's going on here? They did ask a few questions about, and you'll read in the book, an apartment that Joe Wexelbomb and his brother rented under rather unusual circumstances, an apartment in a different building than Trump Tower, but that was owned personally by Donald Trump. Well, Joey Wexelbomb comes up for sentencing before the new judge. He gets a very light sentence, and 18 months after he walks into prison, he walks out. He also says he has no money, he can't pay his fines. By the way, the people who drove the drugs, the little fish, 20 years. Up to 20 years. So Donald's letter seeking mercy worked. This big drug guy, he got a light sentence. Now think about that not only in the context of his not showing mercy, but rather brutality toward this sickly child who's helpless. But in terms of all of Donald's attacks about murders and rapists and drugs and, in the black communities of America, he basically has said nobody has a job and everybody has crime and no one has an education. Think about those in the context of that. By the way, when Joe Wexelbomb came out, he said he didn't have money to pay the fines that he owed that were imposed by the court, but he did move into a $2.4 million apartment in Trump Tower. Now, all throughout his career, Donald Trump has been the subject of lawsuits. He cheated employees, he's cheated vendors, he has been accused of swindling investors in projects that his name was on. He's settled many of these cases and had them sealed, so we don't know exactly what happened, but we have his testimony in many of these cases. And his testimony is generally one of two categories. I had no idea. Or, well, you were lucky if you invested in this that the project failed when it did. You could have put all your money into the project and you'd have lost more money. That's his approach to these things. Donald, when it comes to these deals, also often pleads that he doesn't know things. And you'll see some answers that he gives to questions presented to him under oath where his answers are gibberish. I don't know what else to call them. You may have watched in December the Republican debate. And in that debate, Hugh Hewitt, very smart right-wing radio talk show host and a lawyer. He represents companies in environmental deals. He's on the protect the company's interest side. And he asked Donald Trump, what's your priority among the nuclear triad? And Donald Trump's answer, which I quote in full, was gibberish. I don't know what else to call it. And Hugh Hewitt asked the question a second time. And Donald says, oh, nuclear, that's like it's so massive and impressive. It's like it's a big deal. And Hugh Hewitt says, Senator Rubio, same question. Well, let me first, Hugh, tell the American people what the nuclear triad is if they don't know. It is the ability of the United States military to deliver nuclear weapons from submarine-based missiles, land-based missiles, or bombers. When you got to be schooled by Marco Rubio, you don't know much. But here's the thing that my wife and I were watching that debate, and I said that should be the lead item in the coverage of the debate tomorrow by everybody. That this is this most crucial matter of your finger on the button, and Donald doesn't know anything. And I said, however, my guess is it'll get minimal mention. Well, actually, a lot of the stories didn't even mention it. They completely missed it because politics reporters cover the horse race. They don't cover policy. They don't know what the nuclear triad is, nor did they know the significance of this question. But here's what turns out people didn't know that's in my book. Hugh Hewitt asked the exact same question 4 months earlier on his radio show. So Donald had 4 months to get schooled on this. And I ran into Hugh here in Washington a couple of weeks ago. Never met him before. And he didn't know about my book. And I told him this story. And he says, yeah. He said, boy, he had 4 months to get ready for that, didn't he? And he didn't do a thing. Donald doesn't know anything. All you have to do is actually step back and listen to what he says. I'm going to tell Nabisco and Ford they can't build a factory in Mexico. It's not within the powers of the President of the United States to go around telling corporations where they're going to spend their money. And where are the principled conservatives on this issue? Can you imagine if President Barack Obama came out and said that? Donald Trump, through his companies, owes millions and millions and millions of dollars to the Communist Chinese Bank of China, which is essentially controlled at the end of the day by the 9 thugs who lead the government in Beijing. Can you imagine what would happen if Hillary Clinton, it turned out, had a credit card from the Bank of China? Donald Trump has received millions and millions of dollars from Russian oligarchs. One of his sons has said, oh yeah, they're one of the biggest sources of money that we have. I don't know how many of you saw, but there was a really terrific, well-done story in the New York Times a few days ago about all the people who are enemies of Putin, either oligarchs or journalists, who've been murdered. And down in the story was this little line that the Duma had passed a law so that Putin could kill people outside the country. Now, we've killed a few Americans outside the country, but they're people who've declared themselves enemies of the state. And you can argue whether that's right or wrong, but look at what Putin's doing. They're poisoning people and poisoning innocent people in some cases, having people shot. If you're an oligarch in Russia, you're either a friend of Vladimir Putin, or you're in jail, or you're living in fear and trying to get out of the country. Donald Trump keeps advancing Vladimir Putin's objective: weaken or destroy NATO. Imagine what would have happened if we had had George W. Bush saying, hey, you know, we should just weaken NATO. The trouble he would be in over this. The most important thing, and the reason I wrote this book, is that Donald Trump is a master at a couple of things. He is a master at setting up business deals in which he puts up no money. He never had a dollar invested in Atlantic City. And extracting money from these deals. That's why his Atlantic City casino business was among the first to fail. There are profitable, successful casinos in Atlantic City right now today. But Trump's name will disappear on October 10th from the last casino because he had badly run places, and instead of investing in the business and growing the business and doing what, and I'm somebody who has co-founded a little business, peanut business, but 25 workers. We reinvest in the business so it keeps growing to create wealth. Donald Trump, pull money out as fast as you can. Pay no attention to the welfare of the business. Just get cash. When Donald Trump filed bankruptcy and stiffed all these contractors, some of whom their businesses failed, many of whom for years struggled to keep the doors open because they felt an obligation to their employees, Donald demanded big, huge fees be paid to him during the bankruptcy, or he would tie them up in litigation. And so they paid him. Until in the 4th bankruptcy, they paid him to go away. Donald is the most masterful manipulator of the conventions of journalism I have ever seen. Donald understands, first of all, that most journalists are very good at accurately quoting people and accurately getting other sides of the story and quoting them, but have no deep understanding of what's going on. And he exploits that. He knows that the tabloids, especially Rupert Murdoch's New York Post, have no real regard for any set of facts. They'll take a good story any day of the week. So he plants a story that his longtime mistress, whom I knew about long before anybody wrote about her, but I didn't regard it as a story. Billionaire has mistress. No, plane takes off in Washington, lands in LA. Not a story in either case. He plants this story with a big picture of his smiling face on the cover of the Post. Best sex ever. Marla Maples, by the way, as you'll read in the book, has disclaimed that statement. She didn't make it. he creates this image of himself as this Midas. It's all a fraud. It is a fraud. There's nothing there. And I know some of you are going to want to ask, how much is he worth? And I'm going to tell you, I don't know, but I know he's not worth, as he said in a matter of days last year, 8.7 billion, 10 billion, more than 10 billion, 11 billion. What I do know is what Donald said under oath when he had to answer questions about how much are you worth. And he said, well, it depends on my emotional state. And the lawyer goes, excuse me, the lawyer who is now the head of enforcement at the SEC. And he asks a little further, and Donald says, well, yeah, I mean, it depends on how I'm feeling that day. That's, what's happening in the world and how my mood is. That's how I determine my net worth. Now, if this guy wasn't running for president of the United States, I think we'd all agree, that's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. That is, nobody does it that way. And throughout his life, Donald has gotten away with this because almost nobody challenges him. Wayne Barrett, probably the best reporter who ever worked in New York City, who got onto Donald very early on and wrote about him at length in the Village Voice, and who, despite working at the Village Voice, had the most extraordinary law enforcement sources of any reporter I've ever known. And I, and a guy named Neil Barsky at the Wall Street Journal, until Donald pulled a trick on him and he got fired, we're basically the only people really examining Donald. Everybody else, he was a good story. What are you going to go do a bunch of work for? Donald said this thing, and it's a good story. And we would say, yeah, well, let's go look up the records. And we would question what was going on there. So before we go to questions, I want to get across to you that the person you have seen, the image created by Donald Trump with the complicity of our major national news organizations, who are utterly failing in their duty with a few notable exceptions. The Washington Post has tried pretty hard. One TV reporter, Katie Tur, has at least asked the tough follow-up questions on him. By and large, Donald Trump has gotten from the press what he wants, to create this image that he is the modern Midas, that, as he said, I alone can save you. That's not the statement of a leader of a free people in a democracy. That's the statement of a would-be dictator. He has said, I love the blacks. And you would think most journalists, even white journalists, would have enough sense to say, boy, that's an interesting way to phrase that statement. And they might want to go look up the times that Donald has been found to have engaged in discrimination against blacks and women and Asians. Found to have done so, been fined for it. They're not doing that. Why is he on all the time? Why has he gotten by the last measure I saw, was more than $4 billion of free media? Because he's like a train wreck. People won't turn away from the TV. Fox News has put out the story that when they turned off Donald, people turn off their TVs or go to another channel. This is no way to run a democracy. This is serious business. And unlike Donald Trump, who can say in his TV show something totally contrary to sound business practice, and I say this as somebody I teach graduate business students and law students part-time, you're fired. He can't fire the dictator in North Korea. He can't fire the Speaker of the House. He can't fire a federal judge who issues an order he doesn't like. Donald Trump tells you he has this sort of vague plan. He's going to build a wall. He's going to get the trillions of dollars, or certainly many hundreds of billions of dollars needed, however he does it, because he's changed slightly now, to round up people in the country illegally. Not the people, by the way, I describe in my book who worked for him and who he cheated out of their wages. But round them up, and other things he's discussed, that he can't do it unless Congress passes legislation allowing him to do that and providing the money. Have you ever heard of a president of the United States picking a fight with the Speaker of the House and then appointing to run his campaign a guy like Steve Bannon, who says at Breitbart that Paul Ryan is a double agent for Hillary Clinton? This is craziness. So I want to take questions from you. I hope that you will read the book. It's a quick read because it's written in news style. There are 44 pages of notes at the end so that you can look up stuff if you don't believe me. My personal email is in the book. And a few people have gotten a hold of me in case people have questions about what material comes from. And I will just leave you with this last point. When I was 18 years old, the San Jose Mercury recruited me to be a reporter, and they hired me at 19. And throughout my career, I have broken stories where people told the editors at the Mercury and at the LA Times and at the New York Times, that's just crazy. That can't be. When I said that the police chief in LA was assigning officers to sleep with women to get political information, that can't be. That they were committing crimes and started a riot, can't be. Had officers undercover in Moscow and Havana. Subsequent events, it all came out to be true. The police chief, in fact, himself bragged in his autobiography that LAPD had undercover officers in Moscow and Havana. And in 50 years at this, where I've accused people of murder, Jack Welch gave up his retirement perks, the head of Ernst & Young lost his job, President Bush made his only tax policy change, the Clintons changed how they filed their personal tax returns. Every bit of the work has held up. It's been scrutinized all over the place, and it's held up. And in this book, you're going to find stuff that will hold up, and I only wish I'd had 5 weeks to do the book because there's a whole much more I wanted to put in there. Thank you.
Johnston talks about Travis' relationship with powerful people. Travis' rise in business brought him into contact with individuals who had connection to organized crime and other controversial figures, guys. One of the most important names in the story is Roy Cohn. Cohn was a powerful lawyer, guys, and a political operator who became an important mentor to Trump. Cohn taught Trump lessons that would later become central to his public style. Fight aggressively, attack your opponents, deny accusation, and never allow yourself to appear weak. So you can see Cohn did a lot to Trump. And when you look at Trump's later political career, you can see why Johnston considers that relationship important. Trump became famous for attacking critics, challenging journalists, and presenting himself as someone who refuses to back down. But Johnston's argument goes deeper, guys. He suggests that understanding the people surrounding Trump during his early years helps explain how Trump learned to navigate a world where power, publicity, and confrontation were extremely important. Also, Johnson talks about an allegation involving a Sikh infant within Trump's extended family and a dispute over financial support and healthcare. This is one of the most disturbing claims presented in the lecture. But it is important to make something clear, guys. This isn't Johnston's account and interpretation of events, not something we should automatically treat as independently established fact. And that is an important distinction whenever we are discussing controversial political figures. But Johnston uses the story to raise a larger question about Trump's character. What happens when money, family, and personal conflict collide? And does the way someone behaves in private tells us anything about how they might behave when given enormous political power? Those are uncomfortable questions, guys. But they are also questions that Johnston believes are worthy asking. Then the presentation moves from Trump's personal relationship to something that becomes central to his entire public identity. That is about his image. For decades, Donald Trump presented himself as an extraordinarily successful businessman. The buildings had his name. The television appearances made him recognizable, guys. The interview reinforced the idea that he was a billionaire, businessman who understood wealth and success better than almost anyone else. But Johnston argues that the reality was considerably more complicated. He describes Trump as someone who understands the media extremely well. According to Johnston, Trump knew the newspaper, Trump knew the television networks, and the journalist needed interesting stories, guys. And he learned how to give them those stories. Sometimes that meant promoting stories about his wealth business, his business's deals, his lifestyle, or his supposed importance. The result was powerful, guys. The more people talked about Donald Trump, the bigger Donald Trump became. And that is one of the most interesting parts of this entire story. Because publicity doesn't always require proof. Sometimes repetition itself can create an image. If people hear for years that someone is enormously successful, eventually many people begin to accept that description without asking how the success was actually achieved. Johnston argues that Trump understood this better than most. And then there is another important part of Trump's business history. Atlantic City, guys. Trump entered the casino industry with enormous ambitions. There was a grand building, huge signs, celebrity appearances, and of course, the Trump name everywhere. But according to Johnston, the businesses struggled and eventually faced major financial problems. Johnston uses Atlantic City as an example of what he describes as an extractive approach to business. In simple terms, the argument is that Trump often focused on extracting as much money and values as possible rather than building businesses designed for long-term stability, guys. Whether you agree with that assessment or not, it raises an interesting question. What exactly makes someone a successful businessman? Is it the size of the buildings, the amount of publicity, the value of a brand, or is it whether the underlying businesses remain healthy over time? And guys, this is where the story becomes political because eventually the businessman became the president. The same public image that had helped Trump become famous was now being transferred into politics. The businessman became the candidate. The candidate became the president. And the millions of Americans had to decide whether the qualities that made Trump successful in the media and the business worlds were the same qualities needed to run a country. Johnston clearly has doubts. One example he raises concerns Trump's understanding of complex national security issues. So, you can see he discusses the nuclear triad, a fundamental concept involving the three major components of a country's nuclear deterrent. Johnston uses this as part of a broader argument about Trump's understanding of complicated policy issues. And this raises an important distinction, guys. A president doesn't personally need to know every technical detail of every government program. That is why presidents have advisors, military officials, diplomats, economists, and also the experts. But as a president does need to understand enough to ask the right question and make informed decisions. And when the stakes involve national security, the consequences of getting things wrong can be enormous. But perhaps the most interesting part of Johnson's presentation isn't actually about Trump. It's about the media. Think about how unusual Trump's rise was. For years, he was everywhere. He was on television, newspapers, magazines, interview, talk shows. He was all over. And eventually, the political coverage. Johnston argues that the media played a major role in building Trump's public profile by giving him enormous amount of attention. And this creates a strange cycle, guys. A politician says something controversial. The media covers it. The controversies generates more attention. More attention generates more views. More views generate more coverage. And suddenly, the politician doesn't have to buy advertising to dominate the conversation. The conversation itself becomes the advertising. Trump understood this extremely well. Whether people loved him or hated him, they were talking about him. And in modern politics, attention is power, guys. That may be one of the biggest lessons from Johnston's presentation. Donald Trump's political rise wasn't created by one speech or one election. It was built over decades. It was built over the television, magazine, branding, and eventually politics. Each stage added another layer to the public image. But Johnston's argument is that we should not only look at the image, we should look behind it. What were the businesses actually doing? Who are the people around him? And what does the history tells us about leadership? Now, obviously people are going to disagree strongly about Donald Trump. Some people see him as a fearless businessman who challenged an establishment that had ignored ordinary Americans. Others see him as someone whose business history and personal conduct raise serious questions about his fitness for political leadership. And that is exactly why discussions like this need to be approached carefully. We shouldn't accept every accusation simply because a famous journalist makes it. But we also should reject criticism simply because we like or dislike the person being criticized. The better approach is to examine the evidence. Separate documented facts from allegations. Separate opinions from reportings. And then make our own judgment. Because political loyalty can sometimes make people stop asking questions. And that is dangerous regardless of which political party we are talking about. If you are going to support a political leader, you should be able to examine their record honestly. And if you are going to criticize a political leader, you should also be willing to examine the evidence honestly. That was what makes political discussions meaningful. Donald Trump's story didn't begin when he entered the White House. It began long before that. The business deals he had, the relationship, and the television appearances. All of these things helped create the political figure the world eventually came to know. And whether you admire Trump or strongly disagree with him, understanding that history is important because before we decide whether someone is fit to lead a country, perhaps we should first understand how they built the reputation that brought them to power. So, now I want to hear from you. After hearing Johnson's argument, do you think that Trump's business history tells us something important about his leadership style? Or do you think his critics have focused too heavily on controversies from his past? And what responsibility does the media have when covering a political figure who generates enormous attention? Let me know what you think in the comments, but keep the conversation respectively, guys. You don't have to agree with someone to have meaningful discussion with them. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts, guys. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care and God bless you.